It's the specific phrasing that matters here. If you just glanced at the headlines this morning or maybe scrolled past the alert on your phone, you probably saw the words sanctions or Venezuela and kept moving. We've seen that movie before, right? For 10 years, we've seen headlines about asset freezes and diplomatic pressure. It becomes background noise. But you need to stop and look at the actual text of the directive that came out of the White House late last night. Because the language has shifted, and the shift is violent. Total and complete blockade. That is not the language of diplomacy. That is not the language of economic statecraft or Treasury Department designations. That is the language of war. Sanctions are invisible. They happen on server racks in New York and London. A wire transfer gets rejected. A bank account gets frozen. It's sterile. It's digital. It happens in the quiet hum of the financial system. A naval embargo, that is physical. That is steel in the water. That is a U.S. destroyer physically parking itself in front of an oil tanker and saying, "You do not move." And that is exactly what was ordered. This isn't just about freezing money anymore. We are talking about the physical interdiction of commerce in the Caribbean. We are talking about the U.S. Navy, which, if you track the fleet movements over the last 48 hours, is currently assembling the largest presence in that region we have seen in decades, effectively drawing a line in the ocean. What people are missing, what the mainstream analysis is glossing over because they are too focused on the political theatrics of it, is the justification. Look at the rationale. The president didn't just say we are blocking the oil to punish the regime. He didn't just say it's about democracy or human rights. He used the word repayment. That is the key. That is the signal. He is framing Venezuelan oil, the actual physical commodity sitting in those tankers, as the property of the United States, owed as compensation for assets that were expropriated years ago. Do you understand the difference? If you freeze an asset, you are holding it until behavior changes. If you seize an asset as repayment, you are taking it. You are liquidating a sovereign nation's resources to settle a debt you decided they owe. That is why you are seeing reports of panic out of Caracas. Not the usual bluster, not the usual televised shout matches. This is different. This is the panic of a regime that realizes the walls aren't just closing in economically, they are closing in physically. If you cannot move a ship out of your own harbor without the U.S. Coast Guard boarding it, you don't have a country anymore. You have a prison. And for everyone watching this from the comfort of their living room, thinking this is just another foreign policy spat, look at the energy markets in Asia this morning. Look at the insurance premiums for shipping in the Western Hemisphere. The market knows what this is. The market knows that when you upgrade from sanctions to blockade, you are one radio silence, one misunderstood command, one nervous captain away from a kinetic event. We aren't watching a trade dispute. We are watching a foreclosure, enforced by the most powerful navy on the earth, and the tenant is refusing to leave. This isn't about politics anymore. It's about physics, and the collision course was set the moment that signature hit the paper. You have to rewind the tape to understand why this specific order on this specific Tuesday changes the architecture of the entire hemisphere. If you just look at the timeline starting yesterday, you miss the actual mechanism that brought us here. You miss the slow, grinding collapse of the old rules. Go back 6 months. Go back to the summer. Everyone was talking about normalization. Remember that? The narrative in Washington, the narrative in the think tanks, was that we needed Venezuelan heavy crude to stabilize the global mix. There were meetings, there were quiet handshakes in Bridgetown. The Treasury issued licenses. Chevron was pumping. The European majors were lining up to get back into the Orinoco Belt. The assumption, the fatal assumption everyone made, was that this was a transaction. We give relief, they give oil, and maybe hold an election that looks halfway decent. Transaction complete. But systems don't work like that when one side is fighting for survival and the other side is fighting for dominance. What actually happened wasn't normalization, it was a stress test, and Venezuela failed it. When the oil started flowing again under those licenses, the revenue didn't go where the international community thought it would go. It didn't go to infrastructure. It didn't go to debt service. It went into the shadow economy. It went into cementing the very power structures the U.S. has been trying to dismantle for a decade. So the system, and when I say system, I mean the complex interaction of U.S. foreign policy, global energy markets, and the legal claims of defaulted bondholders, the system realized that standard leverage was broken. You cannot sanction a ghost. You cannot financially strangle an entity that has already learned to live without a bank account. That is the context you need to grasp. The sanctions regime of the last 10 years, the maximum pressure campaigns, they were designed for a world that plays by the rules. They assume that if you cut off a country from SWIFT, they panic and come to the table. But Venezuela, and this is the part the academics keep missing, Venezuela mutated. They built a parallel structure. They started using the dark fleet, tankers with transponders turned off, painting over hull names, ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the South China Sea. They built an economy that exists entirely off the grid. So when Trump comes in and looks at the dashboard, he sees a country that has effectively immunized itself against financial sanctions. You can freeze their accounts, they don't use them. You can block their credit cards, they deal in cash and gold. The total blockade isn't an escalation of the old strategy. It is an admission that the old strategy is dead. It is a shift from financial warfare to kinetic enforcement. And here is where it gets dangerous. Here is where the repayment narrative becomes the most potent weapon in the arsenal. For years, U.S. companies, Exxon, ConocoPhillips, the bondholders who bought Venezuelan debt, have been stuck in legal limbo. They have pieces of paper that say, Venezuela owes us billions. Courts in Delaware say, yes, they owe you billions, but there is no way to collect. You can't seize a country. You can't repossess a refinery in Maracaibo. Until now. By framing this blockade as a repayment mechanism, the administration has essentially deputized the U.S. Navy as a collection agency. Think about the precedent that sets. Just sit with it for a minute. We aren't just saying you can't sell this oil. We are saying this oil is physically ours because you didn't pay your mortgage. It transforms international waters into a jurisdiction of seizure. And the mainstream conversation, the cable news panels, they are arguing about whether this is legal under international law. They are bringing on professors to quote the UN Charter. They are missing the point entirely. International law is a consensus. It only exists if the people with the biggest guns agree to follow it. When the United States, the guarantor of freedom of navigation, decides that specific ships are now contraband, the law changes, the reality changes. This puts every other player in the region in an impossible position. Look at the Caribbean nations. They rely on Petrocaribe. They rely on discounted energy. Suddenly, the U.S. Navy is parking destroyers in their shipping lanes. Do they defy the U.S.? Do they freeze? Look at the insurance markets in London. This is the boring part that actually runs the world. Every ship needs insurance. Every cargo needs indemnity. As of this morning, if you are a Lloyd's underwriter, how do you insure a tanker coming out of Venezuela? You don't. You can't. Because the risk isn't bad weather or piracy anymore. The risk is the United States government. So the trade stops, not because every ship is stopped, but because the system that allows ships to move, the insurance, the financing, the legal cover, evaporates instantly. That is the definition of a blockade. You don't need a wall of ships touching bumper to bumper. You just need to make the cost of crossing the line infinite. Now, let's talk about the human element, because this is where the easy fix narrative falls apart. You will hear people say, Maduro just needs to step down, or they just need to pay the debt. It sounds logical, it sounds rational, but dictatorships in their final phase are not rational actors. They are survival engines. The regime in Caracas cannot pay the debt. The numbers are too big. The economy is too shattered. And they cannot step down because in their calculus, losing power means losing their lives. There is no retirement home in the south of France waiting for them. So you have an immovable object, a regime fighting for literal survival, meeting an unstoppable force, a U.S. administration that has decided to physicalize the conflict. This is the friction point. And usually when you have this kind of friction, you have a release valve. A diplomat flies in, a back channel opens, a deal is cut. But look at the rhetoric. Total blockade, repayment. There is no release valve here. The U.S. has demanded something, total repayment, that Venezuela cannot give, and Venezuela has staked its legitimacy on resisting the imperialist aggression. Both sides have burned the bridge behind them. And while the giants are staring each other down, look at what happens on the ground. Venezuela imports almost all of its refined fuel. They have oil, but they can't refine it because their refineries are rusted hulks. They swap crude for gasoline. If you block the tankers going out, you also block the tankers coming in. No gasoline, no diesel. This means the trucks that move food from the ports to the cities stop running. This means the generators that keep the hospitals powered when the grid fails, they go silent. We aren't talking about a recession. We are talking about the mechanical seizure of a society. When the diesel stops, the water pumps stop. When the water pumps stop, you get cholera, you get dysentery, you get a humanitarian crisis that makes the migration waves of the last few years look like a trickle. And this is the part that haunts me, the part that tells me the people making these decisions haven't fully modeled the second-order effects. They think this pressure will crack the regime. They think if they squeeze hard enough, the generals will turn on Maduro and we get a nice, clean transition. But history, if you actually read it, shows the opposite. When you starve a country, the guys with the guns eat first. The population starves. The middle class flees. But the Praetorian Guard, they get the last of the steak. They get the last of the fuel. The blockade doesn't weaken the regime's hold on the resources that are left. It strengthens it, because suddenly the government is the only entity that has anything. If you want to eat, you have to be loyal. So we are setting up a scenario where we destroy the society to save it. We are seizing the assets to pay a debt, but in the process, we are incinerating the value of the country we are trying to collect from. It's a feedback loop of destruction. And the scary part? The system, the political incentives in Washington is rewarding this. It looks strong, it looks decisive. We are taking back what's ours. It plays great on a bumper sticker, but in the engine room of geopolitics, in the dark, cold reality of logistics and supply chains, we have just thrown a wrench into the gears of the Western Hemisphere. And we're just standing there watching the sparks fly, waiting to see what breaks first. To really see how this blockade kills a country, you have to stop thinking about economics and start thinking about biology. You have to think about the human circulatory system. Imagine a patient on a heart-lung machine. The machine does two things. It takes the bad blood out, cleans it, and pumps the fresh blood back in. It's a loop. If you cut the line going out, the patient dies. If you cut the line going in, the patient dies. Venezuela is not a normal oil producer. This is the technical detail that the headlines ignore, but it is the single most important physical fact in this entire geopolitical mess. Venezuelan oil, the stuff that actually sits in the ground in the Orinoco Belt, is closer to tar than it is to liquid. It is heavy, it is sludge. It is so thick that it cannot travel through a pipeline on its own. To move it, to get it from the well to the port, you have to mix it. You have to inject what are called diluents. naphtha, light crude, chemical thinners. These act like blood thinners for the industry. Venezuela doesn't produce enough of these diluents. They have to import them. So here is the loop. They import the thinners, the fresh blood, to mix with the sludge so they can export the oil, the bad blood, to get the money to buy more thinners. The total blockade cuts the IV line. Now watch what happens mechanically when that line is cut. It is not just that the trade stops, it's that the patient, the infrastructure itself, begins to suffer irreversible necrosis. When you stop injecting the diluents, the oil currently sitting in thousands of miles of pipeline stops. It doesn't just sit there. It cools, it settles, it hardens. It turns into asphalt inside the pipes. This is the hidden mechanism that nobody in the White House briefing room is explaining. This isn't a light switch. You can't just turn the blockade off in 6 months and say, okay, start pumping again. If that oil solidifies, you have to rip the pipelines out of the ground and rebuild them from scratch. You effectively destroy the country's capacity to produce energy for a generation. We are not just seizing the inventory, we are cementing the factory shut. Now, broaden this out to the naval aspect. How do you physically stop a ship? People imagine a movie scene, Navy SEALs rappelling onto a deck, guns drawn. That will happen once or twice, sure, just for the cameras, to set the example. But the real mechanism is quieter. It's the digital siege. Every ship has a transponder, an AIS signal. It tells the world who it is, where it is, and what it's carrying. The order Trump signed effectively designates any vessel that touches a Venezuelan port as radioactive. Here's the chain reaction. A tanker enters the blockade zone. Satellite surveillance tags it. The U.S. Treasury adds that specific ship's IMO number, its permanent ID, to the blacklist. Instantly, and I mean instantly, the ship's insurance is voided. The ship's owner receives a notice of default from their bank. The captain is told by the port he was heading to, maybe in India, maybe in China, that he cannot dock, because if that port lets him dock, they get sanctioned too. So the ship becomes a floating prison. The crew is stuck. The oil is stuck. They drift. We are going to see ghost armadas piling up in the Caribbean, ships that legally don't exist, carrying cargo that nobody can buy, crewed by sailors who can't go home. And this is where the repayment narrative acts as the final trap. Usually, in a sanctions scenario, the oil is considered frozen. It still belongs to Venezuela, they just can't use the money. But because the U.S. has declared this is repayment for stolen assets, we are creating a legal framework to auction the cargo. Think about the psychology of that. If you are a Venezuelan general or a mid-level bureaucrat running the oil ministry, and you see the U.S. Navy literally auctioning off your country's resources to pay back ExxonMobil, what do? Do you surrender? No. You scorch the earth. You sabotage the wells so the Americans can't have them either. You dump the oil. You burn the terminals. The mechanism of total blockade combined with asset seizure removes the incentive for preservation. It creates an incentive for total destruction. If I can't have it and you were trying to take it, nobody gets it. That is the mechanism we have activated. We haven't just locked the door to the economy, we've trapped a desperate animal inside a room full of explosives, and we just threw a flashbang through the window. So where does this land? If we look past the breaking news banners and the shouting matches, what does the world actually look like 6 months from now? Let's strip away the hope. Let's strip away the political promises. Let's look at the trajectory. The 6-month horizon. The black market boom. By mid-2026, the official trade with Venezuela will be zero. The blockade will look like a success on paper, but nature abhors a vacuum. You're going to see the rise of a massive state-sponsored criminal logistics network. We saw it with Iran, we saw it with Russia, we'll see it on steroids here. The dark fleet will expand. These are rusty, 30-year-old tankers bought by shell companies in Dubai or Hong Kong, operating without insurance. They will turn off their transponders. They will paint over their names. They will transfer oil to Chinese vessels in the middle of the night, 500 miles offshore. The U.S. Navy will catch some of them. They'll make high-profile busts, but they can't catch them all. The ocean is too big. So the oil will flow, but it will flow at a 50% discount. Who buys that discounted oil? Our strategic rivals, China, India. They will take the risk because the price is too good to ignore. So, ironically, the blockade subsidizes the energy costs of our competitors. We drive down the input costs for Chinese manufacturing by forcing Venezuela to sell to them for pennies on the dollar. Meanwhile, inside Venezuela, the lights go out. Permanently. The humanitarian corridor will collapse. We will see a migration crisis that dwarfs 2018. Millions of people moving north, not because they want to, but because the water pumps stopped working. And this will create a new political crisis at the U.S. border. The same administration ordering the blockade will have to deal with the human fallout of that blockade, showing up at the Rio Grande. The 2030 horizon. The splinter net of trade. Zoom out further. This is the part that changes your life, even if you never touch a drop of oil. This move, seizing sovereign resources as repayment, breaks the trust that holds the global financial system together. For 80 years, the deal was, you put your money in dollars, you use Western banks, and as long as you're not a terrorist, your money is safe. That deal is dead. By 2030, we will see a bifurcated world. Zone A, the dollar zone, the US, Europe, Japan, Australia, highly regulated, totally transparent, interconnected. Zone B, the sanction-proof zone, China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, parts of Africa, and Brazil. They will build their own insurance systems, their own clearinghouses, their own maritime laws. They will do this out of necessity, because they look at what happened to Venezuela in December 2025 and they say, we cannot let the Americans have a kill switch on our economy. This means everything gets more expensive. It means supply chains get shattered. It means if you want a component made in Zone B, you can't buy it if you live in Zone A. The era of global trade is over. The era of block trade has begun. The human response. Why you feel uneasy. Now, let me talk to you directly for a second. If you're listening to this and you feel a tight knot in your stomach, if you feel like the world is getting more volatile, less predictable, more dangerous, you aren't crazy. You are detecting the signal through the noise. You have spent your entire life in a world where there were rules. They were imperfect rules, sure, but there were lines. Countries didn't just pirate each other's ships. Debts were settled in courts, not with destroyers. What you are witnessing right now, this week, is the final shredding of that rulebook. We are returning to a much older, much darker form of history, a history where might makes right, where resources belong to the strong, where sovereignty is just a polite fiction that we ignore when we need something. It is unsettling because it exposes the fragility of the civilization we built. You realize that the gas in your car, the food on your table, the value of the money in your bank account, it all rests on a delicate web of agreements that are being snapped one by one. So what do? You don't panic. Panic is a commodity they are trying to sell you. You pay attention, you diversify, you stop assuming that just because a system worked yesterday, it will work tomorrow. The world didn't end this week, but it changed. The mask slipped, and once you see what's underneath, the raw power, the steel, the indifference to consequence, you can't unsee it. Stay awake. Watch the water. This is just the first wave.